Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you here to NCTA. My name's James Assey. I'm the Executive Vice President here at NCTA. Today we are kicking off a new series which we've titled NCTA Connects. Our aim with this series is to connect people to ideas, and in so doing to try and contribute to the ongoing policy debates that affect media, communications industries, and to provide some information, analysis, and discussion, and in today's case, coffee, fruit, muffins, but we're glad you're here. Today's program, we're going to focus on the evolving internet, and we're going to highlight, hopefully, some changes that are taking place in the internet ecosystem, both in terms of consumer usage patterns, as well as network pricing models that promote fairness and investment. And we've also consciously chosen the title of today's program as The Evolving Internet to really try and highlight the incredible journey that we're on when it comes to internet communications. You know, while 71% of households today have broadband, it's worth reflecting that a decade ago the number was roughly half that, and the top speeds for residential broadband service were 1.5 megabits. A decade ago, Facebook was still 2 years away, and then it would be another year on top of that before the first video was uploaded to YouTube. So we live in interesting times, and we're lucky enough to have lived through the dawn of the internet revolution. But with that revolution also comes evolution. And that evolution continues today as capital investment, competition, and demand are raising new opportunities and challenges for consumers, for providers, and for all in the internet ecosystem. So we're fortunate, very fortunate today to be joined by three distinguished guests to aid us in this discussion, and I'm going to read their bios to you all now so that they can get on with their presentations. On the far end there is Dave Caputo. Dave is the co-founder, president, and CEO of Sandvine. Dave is responsible for leading an enthusiastic team of professionals committed to protecting and improving the quality of experience on the internet. Prior to co-founding Sandvine, he was the vice president of marketing for Pickstream, which was later sold to Cisco. At Cisco, Dave was the managing director for video networking business unit and was formerly the product marketing manager at Hewlett-Packard. And Dave is going to walk us through some internet usage trends that are related to a report that Sandvine puts out twice a year, I think. Then next closest to me is Stephen Wildman, professor at Michigan State University. Stephen is the James Quello Professor of Telecommunications Studies and director of the James H. and Mary B. Quello Center for Telecommunications Management and Law at Michigan State University. Prior to joining Michigan State in fall of 1999, Dr. Wildman was an associate professor of communication studies and director of the program in telecommunications science, management, and policy at Northwestern University. Professor Wildman is going to be talking about the paper that he is releasing today, a paper in which research support was provided by NCTA that he wrote in coordination with his colleague Johannes Bauer. We're very happy to have Professor Wildman here with us today. And lastly but not least, Professor Dan Lyons, who is an assistant professor at Boston College Law School. He specializes in the area of property, telecommunications, and administrative law. Before joining the faculty, Professor Lyons practiced energy, telecommunications, and administrative law at the firm of Munger, Tolles, and Olson in Los Angeles. So that is the order. I'm going to relinquish the podium and turn it over to Dave. For those of the Twitterati that are in the audience, I think there's a hashtag NCTA Connects. So you can have at it. But with that, let me turn it over to Dave to provide us with some context on internet usage.
Thanks, James. I'll just quickly tell you about Sandvine. Sandvine is a networking equipment company that sells exclusively to service providers that deliver a consumer broadband experience. And when our equipment goes in the network, a few things generally happen. The quality of experience for the users goes up, the costs of operating the network go down, the network's more secure, and the service provider has new ways of generating value from their subscribers through diversifying their service offering. We're now deployed in over 250 broadband service providers around the world, serving over 300 million internet subscribers, and we're in about 90 countries around the world. In fact, all the countries that you see in green there, we have full deployments of our solution. About I guess maybe 8 years ago, we started publishing what we call global internet phenomenon, what we saw as the most interesting trivia that's occurring on the network in the networks we're deployed. It was in our first report that we published that 50 to 60% of all traffic on the internet was peer-to-peer file sharing. We were called heretics at the time. Popular wisdom that was web surfing and email that was driving internet growth back then. We've now been cited in numerous academic journals as the company that's brought that knowledge to the fore. And we'll talk about how some of that traffic has evolved over the years. But to the extent that you're interested in this report, we publish it a couple times a year. If you go to sandvine.com, you could sign up for it, and you could see some of the more interesting discoveries we make every 6 months or so. So when you're talking about usage, it's pretty interesting to look at what's happened to both the median and mean of usage over the years. And you could see that the average has more than doubled in the past year to about 51 gigabytes in monthly usage. And the median, which is the number that 50% use below and 50% use above, is about 17 gigabytes. And when you start looking at these numbers and understanding that the adoption of broadband and the amount of utilization is going up, and you understand that the costs of building these networks, investing in these networks and creating them has been and forever will be based on the peak utilization of these networks, you begin to understand that there's an interesting dilemma that's happening for service providers around the world. This is just North American data. What you see is the share of traffic has really shifted over the years. What we call real-time entertainment, streaming of audio and video, has really created the lion's share of what's consuming bandwidth. And in green there, you see peer-to-peer file sharing. While its share is going down, when you cross that with the data I showed you previously about the usage more than doubling, peer-to-peer file sharing is still a big phenomenon. It's still growing as aggregate bandwidth, but there's no question as a share it's has shifted to real-time entertainment. It's interesting to look at the breakdown of users and how much they occupy. 1% of users use 14% of all bandwidth, the top 1%, and the top 5% use more than the bottom 80. And if that distribution doesn't do it for you, perhaps this will. If you look at different monthly usage amounts, you have about 56% using more than 10 gigabytes. If you jump up to 300 gigabytes, a very common number used out there, it's about 1.5% of all users consume more than 300 gigabytes in a month. And if you go all the way up to a terabyte, it's about 7 out of 1,000 folks consume over a terabyte of data on a monthly basis. If you go back to the point I was making earlier about it always has been and it always will be the cost of the network, just like the electricity grid, the cost is 100% based on the peak capacity of the network. And what we're seeing is, if you look at the red line there, these are active subscribers, and it might go down, or active connections, I should say. It might dip down to about 84% and go up to its peak number, which would be 100%. It gives you the idea that people are always connected to the network, or certainly their devices are always connected to the network. And that we're seeing a real flattening and going up to 100% where people's connections are continually active. And then if you look at the peak, and this peak or prime time exists in every market that we look at, and it shifts by an hour or two here or there. It's basically from about 9 p.m. to about 11:30 p.m. You have the most number of users consuming the most amount of bandwidth. But what we're seeing as usage-based billing is absolutely taking hold around the world. We're seeing some pretty good innovations that are maybe reminiscent of peak utilization of phone networks not that long ago, when you used to wait till 11 p.m. before making that phone call to your girlfriend. That in the wee hours of the morning, there is a lot less bandwidth consumed. And what we've seen both in Canada, I can think of TechSavvy, PlusNet in the UK, where they say we're not going to count usage if you consume traffic during times when their network is not congested and not heavily utilized, that they zero rate that traffic. And that traffic exists there, and for the stuff that isn't real time in nature, the stuff that you're downloading and you're going to consume later, as opposed to entertain me right now, you can see some innovation that's occurring for people, service providers trying to take advantage of when their network is not overly utilized. And then this is just a fun little slide that just shows every one of those peaks are a key event that occurred over the Olympics, and how bandwidth spiked here in the US. And it was interesting to see that you could start planning for isolated events or non-recurring events to think about the investments that might be required in your network to give a great customer experience. And there was whenever Michael Phelps swam, or there was a key event that the US was competing in, you saw really off the chart bandwidth consumption, and it was 100% driven by the event that was occurring at that moment in time. And then I want to just talk about how in other parts of the world, and particularly in mobile, that have embraced usage-based pricing, and how that's created accessibility that wouldn't be there otherwise. This is an example of Movistar Colombia, and they were able to see that people weren't using their internet connection on their phone because they were afraid of what it might cost them. And the killer application on mobile data has absolutely been cost certainty. People want to know what it's going to cost. And if you look at these tiers in Colombia, you could divide those numbers by 2 to get to US dollars. So they could offer a tier so long as someone is happy with the ability to just do email on their mobile device for $5 a month. They could offer a social networking tier for about $10 a month. And they know they could use that application, which we were able to see through our tool set, that 98% of people in Colombia with mobile data plans visited Facebook. In fact, 1 in 3 had visited in the past hour. So they're constantly on it. And they had this understanding that no matter how much I use Facebook, it is only going to cost me $10 a month. And as I look at the mobile data as it's rolling out around the world, usage-based pricing and application-based tiers is becoming more and more the norm, because people want to know, they know what they use, and they want to know what their bill is going to be at the beginning of the month in prepaid and the end of the month on postpaid. And then finally, what I wanted to point out is this is starting to happen here in the United States as well. This is a tier service offerings that are available from GCI in Alaska. They have cable, they have mobile, they have DSL, and this is a tier we help them deploy, and they very clearly tell you how much bandwidth is included in your offering, and very clearly show you how much overage would cost if you decided to go there. And so, although this is absolutely happening on a global scale, we're seeing increasingly, or we're starting to see that it's starting to take place here in the United States as well. And I think that's my 10 minutes there. I'll be happy to take questions after the presentation.
Great.
You can key the, there we go, it's there. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And we were asked by NCTA to look at usage-based pricing from the perspective of an economist. And most of the policy debate to this point has taken place largely in the public literature. That is, it's been in the trade press, it's been in news reports and so on. But with rare exceptions, there hasn't been a lot of systematic analysis. And so both Johannes and I are economists. Johannes can't be here. He's in Austria on sabbatical, and for some reason he decided not to come back. Even economists can be rational at times, I guess. And what we're looking at, though, is the economics of this kind of a pricing plan. And it's not to say that economists haven't looked at usage-based pricing before, but surprisingly, even though there's a very large literature that looks at pricing strategies for other markets and other kinds of products that are extremely similar. In terms of internal logic, they're the same thing we have with usage-based pricing. That literature and the learnings of that literature have not been applied to the application of usage-based pricing to broadband. And so, and this is not the beginning of an economist joke. Right? I can only think of three, and I think the reason is probably because most people fall asleep before you get to the punchline. And so what does it look like to an economist? Well, you've heard the description that basically you have these tiered offerings and you have different capabilities within each tier. And that's sort of a description in terms of the engineering of it and the way it might look to a subscriber. An economist sees it differently. An economist looks at it as a way to segment a market. And it goes by a lot of names. One is second-degree price discrimination. Now, that name isn't being used a lot anymore because there's some ambiguities. And I should mention that economists just view discrimination as ways of segmenting a market. It's not something that has a pejorative or no value-laden connotation at all. Differential pricing is more commonly used right now, or because it is so common for information goods and information services, the term versioning has come about. You have different versions of a product or service. That's made popular by Hal Varian, who before he became Google chief economist was an economist first at Michigan and then at Berkeley. In fact, in the Shapiro and Varian book, Network Rules, there's a whole chapter devoted to versioning. And so how common is it? Well, we encounter it all the time. You buy a tablet computer and you're asked how much memory do you want? How fast is the processor? Different versions, different prices. Same thing with your smartphones, and before that, the feature phones. Automobiles, when preparing this report, I just went online in the Lansing area, looked for the prices of local dealers for Chevy Malibus. There are 8 different models available with different sets of capabilities, and they vary in price from about $22,000 to a little above $30,000. And you get better seat upholstery, higher horsepower, and different features, sunroof or not. And we run into this all the time. You buy your insurance this way. How big is your deductible? How much coverage do you want? When you buy tickets for a football game, how close to the 50-yard line? How close to the field? And so you're looking at an attribute that is generally valued by all people, but people value it in different amounts. And because they value it in different amounts, it makes it possible to offer different bundles with different amounts and charge people different prices for the different bundles. What are the consequences for that? Well, it's not a guarantee. That is, there's theoretical ambiguity, as there always is with price discrimination. But in general, there is a predisposition to expect that you will improve both economic efficiency as well as consumer welfare. And there's a strong reason for that. Go back a slide. And that's because if you are precluded, or if you don't find it profitable to use a differentiated pricing model, then you're lumping everybody together regardless of how much they're willing to pay. And so the tendency then, under that kind of a model, those people that are willing to pay the most, their dollar votes count more, and the service and the pricing gets weighted more towards them. And when you're allowed to differentiate, then you can offer a lower price bundle that people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford it or wouldn't have found it profitable to take, or personally profitable, will be able to do so. And so in differentiating, offer a differentiated set of bundles, you then expand the range of consumers that are willing to take the product and find it in their own self-interest to do so. And there are good reasons to believe the case. That's the way it works for broadband, right? Now, those aren't the only benefits. And it makes it easier to allow people to comfortably adjust the amount of service they take. So if you look at the usage-based plans, almost all of them bring you up to a threshold, which you have a threshold in your plan. Beyond that, you pay another amount, a higher amount, to be able to consume more. For the most part, people stay comfortably within those bands. But it was nice that in the Sandvine report we saw the Olympics, and we'd already put in here Olympics, March Madness. Michigan State, you have to think about March Madness, right? The World Cup, times when people consume more bandwidth than they would otherwise. Now you can imagine that most of the time, if you're somebody like me, I don't do a lot of streaming, so I don't need a lot of data service over the course of a month. On the other hand, March Madness comes along, games are on all day, I want to watch more, I need more bandwidth. One option would be to call my cable provider up, and I could say, put me on a different plan. At the end of March, I call them up again and say, take me off that plan. And so once a year, I have to make these two transactions. It's costly for me, it's costly for them. The tendency would be either to take more than I need and keep it all year just so I have it at that time, or to forego watching March Madness. Right? This allows me then to sort of rent capacity. You can think of other people who watch the World Cup. I'm not a soccer fan, at a different time. And so we have this extra capacity that's sitting there that can then be leased out, in effect, to the various people that want to use it at different times. So we can share that capacity. And an important feature is it reduces the risks of trying it if you're somebody who hasn't done it before. So we got the figure earlier that 70% have it now, 30% don't. Most of those 30% are people that don't experience it in the office, don't experience it in the school, and so they don't know what broadband brings to them. And broadband is a general purpose technology. It enables many things. It's hard to know which of those many things you're going to like until you've taken it, or if you're going to like any of them. And so there's a risk associated with buying. If you can offer people a lower priced, lower featured option, you can lower that risk and you get more trials. And in a period when expanding the broadband infrastructure has become a critical U.S. policy goal, right? An advantage is that this gives people an incentive to take it. And research we've done at Michigan State shows that once people take it and they discover the benefits that are there, they want more. And so as you become experienced, you learn the capabilities that you couldn't have anticipated otherwise. And that people will tend to stick on, and they'll take higher quality service as well. So there are promotional advantages that sort of fit nicely with national policy objectives. And this relates as well to the investment incentives. We're going to expand the infrastructure, and there are rural areas, there are poorer urban areas where the infrastructure isn't there or people don't take it. And it's important to realize that what we're talking about, just as we saw in the presentation earlier, a shared infrastructure. Right? So much of the infrastructure that comes by my house, by your house, and brings me a broadband connection is shared as common cost with other people in the neighborhood, and going higher up in the network is shared with people there as well. Now, what does differential pricing allow us to do? It allows us to collect small amounts of contributions for different people that pay different amounts, but collectively it adds up to contributing to cover the cost of that shared infrastructure. To get an example, suppose that we have two people. One person, the amount they're willing to pay would contribute $6 a month towards that shared infrastructure. And compare that to their neighbor who doesn't value broadband as much, what they're willing to pay would contribute $2 a month. Right? Now, if we're required to choose a single price, and we got 100 of one type and 100 of the other, well, 100 times 6 gives me $600 a month. I'm going to go with the higher price service. Right? So you won't have the people willing to pay less on the network at all. On the other hand, if I can find a way to differentiate the service, and I can collect 6 from one and 2 from the other, I definitely want to do both. And that's really the underlying logic. If I can collect more, it makes the investment more profitable. If the investment is more profitable, I'll invest in areas where I wouldn't have been before. In areas that are smaller and less densely populated, I'll get more competition than I would have before. So the investment effects are salutary as well. And those are really the two big things that we address in our report. The fact that we would expect the consumer consequences of UBP to be positive, as more people take it, more people get stuff they want. And second, it creates a private market incentive to invest in the infrastructure and expand it further into the country. That's my report.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed Professor Wildman's paper, and I think it adds a lot of perspective to this sort of nation debate about usage-based pricing. My goal in the next few minutes is to sort of add a legal gloss to his economic analysis, to put usage-based pricing into the movement into context, and then to address some of the more significant concerns that have been raised by usage-based pricing opponents. Professor Wildman, I think, is exactly right that most forms of usage-based pricing should be thought of as second-degree price discrimination. Of course, this sounds sinister, and I think it's very smart of economists to try to begin rebranding that term, right? But it happens all the time, and it's relatively uncontroversial. So I'm on my flight down from Boston to D.C., and the student two rows, you learn when you fly out of Boston that half the flight's filled with students, right, at any given time. The student 2 seats over leans over to me as I'm reading the paper, and he says, you know, I'm going home, I'm really excited, I'm going home to see my family, and I got this incredible deal on these tickets. It's like $140 round trip. And so my first thought is, well, it's incredibly odd that you're sort of leaning over and bragging about price to a total stranger. This is socially awkward, right? But then it occurs to me that, like, a law professor calling somebody else socially awkward is probably a common situation. But then it occurs to me, this is like the perfect setup for the story, right? Because I paid considerably more than $140 for my ticket. And it's an example of second-degree price discrimination at work, right? The airline paid the same amount to transport me and this other student, or the student, and in fact, probably zero marginal cost to transport us, right? Because the flight's going to go from Boston to National, whether I'm on it or she's on it. But despite that, they charge her $140. They charge me more than that, and everybody knows it, and everybody's okay with it, right? So this is exactly the kind of thing that happens regularly, and usage-based pricing is no different in the broadband space. Right? So by using different tiers of service, companies can segment their customer base based on the willingness of different customers to pay. And then the idea is to try to charge more to those who value the service more. It should be no more controversial than the airline example. And I think that's why Chairman Janikowski and the net neutrality order endorsed usage-based pricing, at least in theory. And John Leibowitz at the FTC is even more loudly proclaiming its benefits. Now, price discrimination has ambiguous effects on welfare, right? But antitrust scholars, I think, agree that in most cases, it's consumer enhancing because it enhances total welfare. And the empirics suggest that's probably true in the broadband industry. So in 2010, Scott Walston and James Rizzo did a study of 25,000 broadband plans in OECD countries where tiered pricing is more common. And what they showed is that on average, customers who had tiered or capped plans are paid on average $164 per year less than those who had similar plans but without a monthly limit. And a lower price means more subscribers, which allows those who don't want to pay for the unlimited flat rate plan, right, in order to get into the market at a lower price point. So I guess one big question is, why, after sort of 15 years of unlimited flat rate plans, are we moving toward usage-based pricing? And I think the big change is the explosion in not just the quantity, but also the qualitative difference in the data that we're demanding of the network. And that's the stuff that Sandmine provided, I think, very clearly. The flat rate model is relatively inefficient, right? Heavier users consume more of the network's total resources, but they pay the same amount of rate, the same rate as lighter users. Now, as the Commission has noted, right, what this means is essentially the lighter users are subsidizing the heavier users. They're paying more per megabyte for the information that they're downloading each month. Now, traditionally, that hasn't been a big issue, right? Because even heavy consumers weren't putting tremendous strains on the network, right? They were, even if you were engaged in lots of web surfing, it wasn't order of magnitude larger than those who were doing less. But now that we're shifting toward peer-to-peer networking and real-time entertainment over the network, the gap between heavier users and light users is astronomical. And so usage-based pricing is not only driving greater network costs, but also allows the network providers to shift more of those costs onto those who are using the network the most. And so some object that it's not fair, not right to put more costs on heavier users, because heavier users impose no additional marginal costs on the network, right? When I go and use Netflix, it doesn't add to the cost that, in my case, Verizon is incurring in order to provide service. Now, except in periods of congestion, that's largely true, but I think it's also largely irrelevant, right? Because pricing broadband at marginal cost would never allow you to recover the fixed costs of building out a network. And those fixed costs are significant. By some estimates, the broadband industry has paid $300 billion over the last 10 years in order to build a wired and wireless broadband plant. And those costs are ongoing, right? So Cisco estimates that American internet traffic is going to triple by 2016, that wireless traffic is going to grow 16 times. And this is going to require, by some analyst predictions, $30 to $40 billion each year in incremental investment. Somebody has to pay for those, right? And so everybody agrees that network providers need to be able to recover their fixed costs, and they need to develop the capital in order to build out those future expansions. And so what we're really talking about here, right, is what is the optimal strategy for recovering those fixed costs? Flat rate pricing is one strategy, and it's built on the principle of equitable distribution of fixed costs. And equitable distribution sounds attractive, but I think there's no proof that this is the only choice or even the best possible choice. Right? In fact, students of Ramsey pricing, which is relatively common in the telecommunications industry, suggests that, in fact, usage-based pricing is probably better. So Ramsey pricing tries to approximate marginal cost pricing while recognizing that you need to layer on fixed costs in order, because marginal cost pricing doesn't work. So the idea is, if you are trying to figure out how to price in order to recover your fixed cost, you increase the cost more on those who are demonstrate inelastic demand, right? Those who are willing to pay more for the service, because you try to preserve the ratio of consumption that you see at marginal cost pricing. Usage-based pricing is a way for network providers to get closer to Ramsey pricing. So usage-based pricing allows consumers to reveal how much they value the service, right, by showing they're willing to pay, those who are willing to pay more for greater consumption. And then it allows network operators to recover those costs by getting more from those who are willing to pay more. Now, some have argued that usage-based pricing can also help alleviate network congestion. I think there's some truth to this, but I think it's a less persuasive justification. We can get into that more, I think, in the Q&A. Generally, I think it's true that if people are not charged on the basis of use, they'll tend to overconsume to get their money's worth, right? You see that in buffets all the time, for lack of a better example. Usage-based pricing imposes additional costs on marginal consumption, and therefore it's at least encourages people to consume less. And so in that sense, it's useful for chronically overtaxed systems like wireless systems that are experiencing congestion regularly. But it's not very useful, I think, to solve the problem of peak time congestion. Right? It's sort of like saying we have a rush hour, and therefore our solution is going to be to cap the number of miles you can drive each month. It'll lower the number of aggregate miles driven, but it doesn't make sure that the miles you're cutting off the system are the ones that are in peak time. Right? A better system is one like London developed, where they figured out what their peak time is, right? And then they charge a tax to cars that are going in and out of the city during the peak time. Now, my understanding is that's had a huge effect on bringing traffic congestion down. And if we could come up with peak time pricing in broadband, that's one type of usage-based pricing that would help. Unfortunately, I think statistically or technologically we're not there yet, but it is something that holds out option in the future. So what are our concerns with usage-based pricing, right? One is the issue of mental transaction costs. or what public knowledge is called decision fatigue. Andrew Olitsko has done a very good job of chronicling that in the literature. Customers walk around making thousands of choices a day, right? And when they get home and they collapse on the couch, all they want to do is watch Seinfeld on Hulu without thinking about whether it's worth the additional $3 that their bill's going to go up each month or whatever, right? But I think as Professor Wildman's paper explains, tiered plans offer customers relief from this kind of decision fatigue. So customers tend to choose plans with higher limits than they represent in their average monthly consumption, in part because they want some insurance effect, right? They're paying a little bit more, and they recognize that, in order to not worry about getting hit with an unexpected overage. And so as a result, right, the tiered plan essentially acts as an unlimited flat rate plan, except for those periods when you see severe demand spikes. So customers generally don't have to worry about decision fatigue each and every time they get online. The second concern we've seen is the notion that companies might use caps in order to create artificial scarcity, right, in order to raise rates. I think this is possible, but I think it's unlikely for two reasons, right? First of all, in a usage-based pricing system, the general idea is networks get paid more if customers use it more, right? So at base, right, a usage-based pricing system would encourage networks to get customers to use the network more, not less. Right, but secondly, I think this sort of artificial scarcity only works if the network provider has market power, right? Otherwise, a customer would be able to, who recognizes that the network provider has given them a bad deal, would simply switch to another provider. But of course, if the network operator has market power, then there's no need to go through this scarcity kabuki dance in order to fleece the customers, right? You can simply raise the rate on the unlimited flat rate plan and pocket the difference. The difference, of course, is that in a usage-based pricing world, scarcity, customers will use their scarce resources efficiently because they're paying every time they add on, right? Whereas in an unlimited flat rate world, you end up with more people consuming more and more, so the only users wind up being the ones who are willing to tolerate congestion the most. Leads to what one person has called the Yogi Berra equilibrium, right? Networks get so crowded that nobody goes there anymore. And then finally, I think the last big issue is anti-competitive effects, right? And that's really where the rubber hits the road in this debate from the legal side. There's a concern that broadband providers are going to use data caps in order to protect their cable business from competition from over-the-top providers like Netflix. Right? No question the incentives are there, and that it's possible for a company to act in this way. But incentives alone are not enough, right? You ask any antitrust scholar, and they'll tell you this is a quintessential vertical restraint on trade. And vertical restraint on trades can be good or bad, depending on the circumstances. So the first thing you need to ask is there market power? Right, again, if the company is engaging in anti-competitive behavior, but consumers can punish that company by switching, right, then it's not as big a deal for antitrust regulators. Now here, the evidence suggests that broadband markets, at least in most of the United States, are at least workably competitive, right? What do I mean by that? Well, the National Broadband Plan suggests that most of us have our choice of 2 or more broadband providers, and if you add wireless, the numbers increase, although query whether they should be considered part of the market analysis. Now, of course, in most instances, 2 or more really means 2, right? The telephone company or the cable company. But Fred Kahn, who was the late Dean of Regulated Utilities Law, tells us that there's not a consensus among economists as to the sufficiency of competition under duopoly. In the broadband field, right, we see churn rates that are somewhere around 30 to 36% each year. And there's a huge movement right now toward customers demanding no contract plans and companies being willing to provide a no contract option for fixed broadband. And as long as that's the case, there's at least some evidence that customers are switching regularly back and forth, and that's evidence, I think, of robust competition. But in addition to market power, you have to look at consumer harm, right? Obviously, if a broadband provider is using its data cap in order to discourage customers from using Netflix, that's bad for Netflix. Right? But the Supreme Court reminds us that antitrust law protects competition, not competitors. And I think the consumer case is less clear, right? Because if the goal, assuming the goal is to prevent people from cutting the cable cord and switching to Netflix as a video provider, right? Then the net effect of trying to keep people to keep their cable subscriptions, it probably hurts those who want to switch and can't because of the data cap. But because the cable plant and the broadband plant share a platform, it probably benefits those customers who have cut the cord. Right? Declining number of cable subscriptions means we have to recover more of our fixed costs from broadband, which means broadband prices go up. And so that'd be bad for broadband-only customers. So the case isn't as clear as I think first observations suggest. Now, so one role I think for regulators going forward is to monitor things very carefully, right? Not to have this sort of ex-ante knee-jerk reaction that usage-based pricing is bad. To recognize there are incentives to use it in a bad way, and to watch carefully for instances in which you need ex-post enforcement in order to protect consumers. Another, I think, is to ensure transparency, right? For usage-based pricing to work, you need companies to be very clear about what their plans are, and customers to understand the data cap implications or data consumption implications of their online decisions. It's a lot easier to calculate the number of minutes you're talking on the phone for a long distance plan than it is to translate your activities into megabytes, right? And so it's really important, I think, for companies to provide easy to use data trackers that tell you how much data you've used each month, and to provide warnings when customers reach those limits. And that's the sort of innovation that we're seeing in the marketplace today, and that's a good thing. And I think my parting thought is that the way the legal debate has developed so far, I think fundamentally misunderstands the role of regulation. The takeaway, I think, from these observations is that it's not usage-based pricing that's your enemy, it's market power that's your enemy, or the consumer's enemy. Different pricing strategies reflect different ways for companies to experiment with business models. Those that succeed are going to be rewarded by attracting more customers to their business. Those that wind up being a net negative to customers will go away because they won't get customers signed up for the plan. And the customer benefits from this experimentation, right, in the form of different offerings, different choices in the marketplace, and more efficient business practices over time. The only time government should get involved, I think, is when these practices are driven by companies that have market power and are wielding that power in a way that harms consumers. Otherwise, I think this experimentation and empirical measurement in the marketplace is a good way to make sure that different customers' needs and preferences are being met. Right? One size fits all, I think, is not a very good way to regulate an increasingly diverse broadband ecosystem. Thank you.
We're going to, what's that, mic'd up? We're going to now have a little bit of discussion and Q&A. We have mics, so please feel free to ask questions from the audience. Just please identify yourself before you ask any questions. But Baron, I get the prerogative to ask the first question. But we'll get to you. It's been a great, thank you again so much for your presentations. It's really, I think, very interesting also to have kind of the intersection of the technology, the economics, and the legal justifications for usage-based billing, and really to try and demystify what is ironically something, as Professor Wildman said, we see in all different areas of life with respect to what economists would call differential pricing. But I was also very interested, Dave, in your observations about the worldwide use of these types of models and experimentations. I kind of looked up at that slide you showed about the Olympics and how the nature and the evolution of how the internet is being used. We can be on Facebook all 24/7 and be using very small amounts of data, and yet when we're watching Usain Bolt at the Olympics, those spikes, I'm sure they make network operators' hearts flutter a little bit. So there's kind of an ongoing challenge for us to continually reinvest in these networks. What are we seeing kind of from a worldwide basis with respect to?
There's certainly a lot of bandwidth consumed in those 10 seconds, but what we're seeing is that the the usage of usage-based pricing and application-based pricing, particularly on the low end, creates a new entry point that I don't think we see here in North America. How many people do you know with a smartphone that have a data connection that pay $5 a month? Well, if they can use a smaller amount of bandwidth, not contribute to the peaks and the congestions, doing stuff like Facebook, doing stuff like email, doing stuff like chat, a $5 pricing tier can be done profitably. But if the expectation is anybody could do anything at any time, then you get the $40 or $60 per month bandwidth usage for that. And so, you know, in Asia, we're seeing very large amounts of usage. Smart TVs become a much bigger phenomenon around the world, where they're much more likely to have their televisions connected to an internet connection. And they're facing the realities of peaks driving the cost of their network and figuring out ways to recover that. And usage-based pricing is one of the fallbacks of doing that, and also the concept of bolt-ons, where you could give someone certainty of the bolt-on of the video tier, that they know it's all they could consume video if they buy that bolt-on, and it won't count towards a tier because they know for this fixed price, it's still usage-based or application-based, but they know that it'll be zero rated towards their overall consumption.
And Professor Wildman, I was struck by your discussion of how these types of mechanisms can actually, or how they dovetail with our national goals, whether you're talking about promoting adoption and getting more people connected to the network, or from the network provider side about encouraging investment. I mean, as you look at that, how do you see those goals being fulfilled by these types of strategies?
I mean, it's become clear, and it's being sort of expressed now in National Universal Service Policy, that broadband has become the equivalent of what basically the telephone network used to be. It's something that is something that's vital for anyone who really wants to participate actively in the social and economic life of the country. And because of that, now we're making a more concerted national effort to get broadband to people that otherwise wouldn't take it, whether it's because of income or because of where they live. And it's expensive to get the technology there. If we limit the ability to use differential pricing, like usage-based pricing, as a mechanism of collecting contributions to shared costs from a larger variety of people, one, we keep more people off the network, right? People that eventually might migrate to more intensive bandwidth uses as they learn more about it. But second, it makes it more expensive to invest in rural and high-cost areas. And everything we lay out there is mostly these shared costs, the common costs of the network. And to cover those costs, you need contributions from as many potential subscribers as possible. If we have just a fixed price that applies to everyone, then the necessity to raise, to cover costs means the price has to be priced at a level that more heavily weights the interests of those that are willing to pay the most. And we basically screen off those at the lower end of the spectrum. And we also screen them off in terms of contributing to network costs, and so we get less investment. It means that if we want to get infrastructure in these areas, there's a bigger requirement that more funds come from the tax base to basically subsidize that. And so in that sense, it limits the contribution that has to come from the public coffers, but also it gives providers an incentive to push it farther. And you were talking about the need for, the bigger issue is competition. Well, the same thing applies. What brings in that marginal competitor? It's the ability to generate enough revenues to cover another set of shared costs. And without the ability to differentially price, then fewer people come in, you have less competition. So again, that works in favor of the national interest.
Dan, you mentioned kind of one of the objections is this concern about the mental transaction costs. And as I look at some of the experiments that are going on, and we looked at the slide that Dave put up there, that 300 megabits, you're talking about really 1.5% of folks that are even reaching that threshold, and it seems like that a lot of the models that are being tried are essentially trying to give people the ability to purchase the amount of data that they need for any particular given month. I thought Professor Wildman said, you know, I may have a really busy month one month, but the next month I may be able to drop down to a different usage pattern. How do you see, you know, dealing with those types of mental transaction costs? You mentioned transparency, and I just wonder, from a transparency perspective, how much of that is can the network operator contribute to? How much of it can the applications provider contribute to in determining how much the consumer is actually using?
Yeah, I think that flow of information is something that needs to be multiple parties playing in, right? And so the example that I often think of is the App Store. So everybody knows when they buy an iPad, right, that there's, what, 16, 32, 64 gigs of space, and that's all I have. And so when they go to the App Store to download an app, right, one of the things that they look at, hopefully, right, is the size of the app, how much space it's going to take up on your tablet. That information is something that only the app provider can give. And the app provider has an interest in providing that because it's one of the key inputs that a customer understands he needs to know. Right, so the more we switch to usage-based pricing, the more aware a customer is going to be about the need to demand that information. Right, how much is this going to provide? And so my sort of dream world is if we move to a more usage-based pricing system. Companies that are providing content and applications over the web will include information about, you know, if you download this is how much data it takes. And it may be that at the margin, one or two, you know, video clips or whatever from YouTube you're not particularly interested in, but you have an idea in the back of your mind so you can keep a running tally of the month. And as long as the network provider is also providing some sort of data tracking tool in the bottom corner of the screen or something you can log into or something, then it alleviates that problem.
Great. Questions from the audience? Baron?
Well, great presentation. I have to say I find the case here so overwhelming. I try to ask myself why this isn't already accepted, why it is that people have a hard time understanding this. And it seems to me it comes down to two things. I'd just be curious to get your thoughts. So one is legal economic, which is the fear that this somehow is going to be used to discriminate against alternative video providers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then related to that is a user interface point. So if the cost here is decision costs, it seems like an important part of the story here is the user interface, the technologies that are, on the one hand, allowing consumers to see how much data they're using and feel comfortable they're not going to exceed their caps. And then on the other hand, to use data if more efficiently. And for example, Dave, I was really interested when you pointed out that there are ISPs around the world who don't meter your use during those off-peak hours. So are we seeing technologies in those markets that would, for example, automatically download your the iTunes subscription for your favorite show during those hours? And in turn, that of course feeds into the point about video competition, because if those technologies exist and are better and are used, you would expect there to be less of a concern about alternative video providers being discouraged or discriminated against because users are afraid to download that much data.
Yeah, I'll take the second part of that question first. The technology has never been more available, and it's really just in the past year or so to give people real-time visibility of how much traffic they're consuming. Myself personally, up in Canada, Bell Canada, I see it with 4 hours back, but Sandvine has the capability of giving people ultimate visibility. Where we've seen service providers do the bandwidth happy hour concept, they absolutely see uptick in bandwidth consumption there than they did before they offered that. So people are modifying their behaviors, either just by doing it themselves, but you're seeing increasingly tools out there from the application providers with stuff that isn't latency or jitter sensitive. Stuff like the backup, the online backup of your system. It's much better for the service provider, and it's probably better for you to do that during the wee hours of the morning. Many backup services will allow that capability. Increasingly, applications will have the ability for stuff that isn't real-time entertainment, stuff that is download and consume later, that you could set it up for during those times to do that. And they'll either do that automatically, or the user has to set that up. Or what we're seeing is there's some automatic things that we could do. You know, Apple comes up with a new update, and everybody's scurrying to download that. Well, you do have the ability, and we do have the ability with some of our customers, where we will decrease the peak ability to do that during times of congestion, during peak utilization of the network. And so the download still occurs, but it happens at a slower rate than it would otherwise during peak time. And then as that peak falls off, the reality is the customer gets it in about the same amount of time or even faster based on that intelligence in the network to make that shift. And the reason is that isn't a latency or jitter sensitive application where someone would perceive the difference of quality they're getting otherwise.
Yeah, I can respond to both points. I'll start with the second one in terms of the transparency and notification and the notion of sort of decision costs. And I mean, I would like, what I would like to see would be given the choice of whether or not I want to be notified on a monthly basis as to whether or not I'm approaching a threshold. I'm a Verizon customer for my 3G plan. And 5 days before the end of my billing period, 3 days before the end, and then the day before, I get a notification that says you're approaching 50% of your threshold. I don't need to spend the time monitoring that. I've only gone over once in maybe 7 or 8 years, but the fact that it's nice to have something happen automatically. So you can lower transaction costs if you have that option just by saying, during the Olympics this is going to happen, don't tell me. I know it's going to happen. And on the other hand, if I am close to that threshold on a regular basis, then perhaps as a customer I want to know. But I think it would be better if people were given that option when they sign up rather than having to be sort of plagued by these constant notifications that you have to respond to and delete and so on that come about on a monthly basis. Now, when it comes back to the question about competing with online video providers, the Netflix or the YouTubes and so on, and that's sort of what makes broadband different from looking at your iPad, because there is this other alternative potential service, and the question then becomes, because you have one provider supplying both, do we see, one, is there incentive, right? And second, is there evidence, because the fact that there may potentially, theoretically be an incentive doesn't necessarily mean it's one that's operative in the marketplace, because there are a lot of incentives that are operational and don't just focus on one. If we think of the broadband providers, well, they're also offering a cable TV service. Where's the biggest growth right now? It's on the broadband side, right? So if you're going to start limiting your bandwidth or limiting your data, putting lower thresholds on data, then you're starting to cut into your revenues from what's the fastest growing part of the market. But the data we saw up here in terms of the Sandvine report showing 1.5% of consumers actually consume more than 300 gigabits a month, right? And that's a common threshold. And so now are we actually trying to discriminate against just that 1.5%? It's a tiny fraction. It doesn't intuitively sound plausible that you're getting much back from having a threshold that applies there. I would be surprised if over time we didn't see an increasing number of thresholds for exactly the reasons the Sandvine report says, because there's a lot of differentiation down below. Your average user is something like 17 gigabytes a month. That's, you're looking at almost 1/20th of that threshold. And so there are people then, you're sharing capacity between people that are using a small fraction of the network compared to people that are using a bigger fraction. And they could benefit by having a lower priced offering available to them. Like my parents who look at Facebook. Not Facebook, yeah, Facebook and a few postings, and occasionally I send them a YouTube video. That's it. They're paying the same amount that I do. So I think we need more differentiation. But look at the evidence. You don't just sort of assume that this one incentive means that bad things are going to happen, because there's multiple incentives, and the data just isn't there right now, I think, to support a presumption that it's being used for anti-competitive purposes.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think the fact that the incentive is there may be reason for ex post monitoring, maybe enforcement after the fact, but I think is absolutely not a justification at all for some ex ante rule that usage-based pricing is bad, particularly given all of the potential consumer benefits that we see from Professor Wildman's paper about the good it can do for customers.
Other questions? Yeah.
I Hi there, I'm John Bergmeyer with Public Knowledge, and I have a
John.
question. If do you think that a peak usage, nights and weekends sort of approach as opposed to a flat monthly cap approach?
Sorry, could you speak up?
Sure. I'm wondering if you think that a peak usage or nights and weekends sort of approach to broadband billing as opposed to like a flat monthly cap that doesn't really smooth out peaks, not only would do a better job at smoothing out peak usage, but do you think that such an approach could provide the kinds of market segmentation and price discrimination benefits that you all have cited today?
I can
Sure.
So I think to the extent that we're worried about congestion, I think peak pricing would be a much better solution to get traffic off the network at times when additional consumption is actually harming other people. Right? The problem, I think, is for peak pricing to work, you have to have peaks with regularity. And I think we see peaks with regularity in the fixed space. That's what we see with sort of the 9 to 11:30 period. But I don't think congestion is as big a problem in fixed broadband, right? The latest broadband speed surveys that the FCC's come out with suggest that there's not a whole lot of slowdown at peak periods on the fixed side. Now on the wireless side, congestion's a big issue. But the problem on the wireless side is that peaks and valleys aren't really predictable, right? They happen in spurts. And so there's no predictability. Without predictability, you can't tell consumers, right? Between 6 and 9 is when you incur greater cost. Don't use your wireless plan during those periods. And so I think that's what I meant when I said I think there's technological challenges to putting peak pricing in place right now.
Yes.
I'm more skeptical about the utility of peak load pricing. If we look at the way it's used in like the old phone networks or electricity networks, you've always applied the peak load pricing at a very high level of network where you've aggregated demands over many, many service territories, and it's predictable at that level. Right? If you get down to the local neighborhood, it's not clear what neighborhoods are going to have peaks at what times. And there's a lot of variation in the demographics and the incomes and so forth that drive the usage in neighborhoods. If we're starting to apply something that is common to everybody, we run the risk then of imposing restrictions on people that otherwise wouldn't be imposing any congestion. And that's the reason why when we look at congestion management in highway systems, it's always the big commuter throughfares that get regulated. It's Route 66 where you have your HOV lanes and at 3 o'clock, I used to live here, and suddenly you can't, it becomes a parking lot and it used to be a freeway. On the other hand, that causes people to spill over on the side streets, but we don't regulate the side streets because it's too costly to monitor that and figure out which ones people are going. If you try to go here, they'll change it here, they'll go somewhere else. And my concern is the transaction cost of putting something at the neighborhood level would just be overwhelming. So it's not clear to me that peak load pricing is really an effective solution.
I think we've got time for one more question. Chairman.
Prerogative.
Mine doesn't count.
Okay.
I'm in that band that doesn't count.
Could you please identify yourself?
My name is Cy.
One of the things that I think is emerging increasingly in kind of mainstream media literature about broadband is a growing recognition by consumers that there are really many points in the chain of a broadband connection that determine the quality of what you get and when you get it. The Wall Street Journal ran a big story about you think you're buying X gigabits per minute, but you're running it through a Wi-Fi router that won't give you more than 20. A lot of articles being written, even by favorable tech journalists, about the Google gigabit project are sort of bemoaning, where's my gigabit? Because they coming to the greater recognition that if Windows doesn't push out of the server at that speed, doesn't matter what your endpoint is. But as we think about congestion, what I always think gets left out of this is there's always two sides to the coin. And I'm curious about whether when we have flat rate pricing, there aren't sufficient incentives for application developers and providers to build software and build applications that are as bandwidth efficient as possible. It's sort of like, if I can use as much as I can get whenever I can get it, the incentives for the developer to experiment in algorithms that have greater compression, other kinds of software and network distribution tools that would make that a much better experience for the consumer seem to be missing. So I wondered if you'd say something about, not just, we always talk about it from the ISP's perspective, probably because we're the ones most regulated. But I often wonder whether we're providing the proper incentives to the development community to use broadband efficiently if we're in a flat pricing world.
I think the thing I'll say to that, and we help our customers look at it from both the quality of experience they're delivering to their subscribers, but also what's the quality of the traffic that's coming into their network. And traditionally there had been this this sort of agreement that if you peered with someone who was giving you a bunch of traffic and you gave them a similar amount of traffic back, you were both sharing pretty equally on the utility of what happened there. And so when you have content providers using content delivery networks and using peering and using transit links to deliver to the service provider, what you're seeing is times when where there's great asymmetry. They're sending you considerably more traffic than you're sending them. And what that does for the service provider is really increases their cost, because before they agreed to share the capital cost requirement there, once it becomes asymmetrical, it's only a requirement for you to increase the amount of connection there, capital costs on the service provider side, that is really purely to the benefit of the content provider. And so I think you're right. You have to look at both sides of this thing on whether the proper incentives are to the application providers to as efficiently deliver the utility that they're delivering there. There's no point in sending a 20 megabit stream to a mobile device that isn't capable of receiving that. It's better to send them a much smaller stream, and it would be good for the service provider, it would be good for the consumer, and it should be much better for the content provider in the long run.
It's a really good point, and there's a really excellent discussion of this in the ILSCO et al. Paper for public knowledge. They talk about Canadian examples and use Netflix, for example, coming up with a more bandwidth efficient means of delivering their service when they found they were getting less bandwidth. Now I think this is partly a matter of speed as well as just the overall threshold you have on the amount of data consumption over the course of the month. Both of them have an effect. But I think if we had a more highly differentiated pricing plan, then there would be more people taking lower end services, which would create a greater incentive for app developers then to come up with services that are more efficient in the utilization, just because they want to expand their own market. And so I think it's one thing we lose when we don't have much differentiation. We don't get as much expansion and as much attention on the efficiency on the app development side.
Yeah, I think you see some app developers right now that are responding just to the existence of the reality of congestion, right? So cloud computing, cloud storage, companies generally back up between midnight and 4 a.m. because if my laptop just started backing up at 9 p.m., it would cause my Hulu connection to skip, right? But I agree. We need more incentives to get app providers to think about using bandwidth more efficiently, and that pressure only comes from one of two places, either a regulator or consumer pressure. So unless you want the FCC getting much more involved in the app space and involving technical standards on upload and download, the way to do that is to get customers to care about their efficiency and put pressure on the services that they're buying in order to make sure they're delivered more efficiently.
I think the way this would look, if I'm downloading an app, then it's similar to when I download an app from my personal computer. Are you a Mac, are you a PC, and so forth. So you'd be having questions then from the service provider saying, what kind of service are you taking? And then you'd be delivered to you the one that's most efficient for your package.
So that's the last word for today, but the evolution will continue. Please join me in thanking our panelists.